what we see today must worry us and jolt us into action. A resurgence of Holocaust denial, attempts to rewrite history, efforts to whitewash and rehabilitate people who committed crimes against humanity. Meanwhile, survey after survey shows increasing ignorance among young people about basic facts of the Holocaust. The United Nations must always be at the forefront of the fight against anti-Semitism and all forms of religious discrimination and racism. We must always stand on the side of the marginalized and persecuted. Anti-Semitism, virulent anti-Muslim bigotry, persecution of Christians, racism, and anti-refugee hatred are becoming normalized in a coarsening public discourse, often amplified in online echo chambers of hate.
Hello, you're watching Scotland in 7. On Friday the 28th of January, I'm Hugh Stewart. Yesterday was the anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Nazi concentration camp, and in the House of Commons in London, members of Parliament held a special debate to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day. Tonight's programme is dedicated to that memory, and I will discuss its lessons for the future with our three special guests tonight. First of all, Ika Ferrer Gotić is in Sarajevo. Dobro večer, Ika. And
Hugh. How are
Smajo
you?
Beso is in Newcastle. His family fled ethnic violence in Bosnia when he was aged 9, I believe. So good evening, Smajo. How are you?
Good evening. Thank you for having me. How are you?
Yes, I'm good, thanks. It's very good to have you joining us tonight. And finally, from East Renfrewshire, we have Kirsten, Oswald, Member of Parliament. And you've made it back up from Westminster tonight, haven't you, Kirsten? So good evening, all of you. And thank you for joining us. So, Kirsten, we'll start off with you. You did actually speak yesterday in the House of Commons as part of Holocaust Memorial Day. So, can we just quickly go to a little clip from what you said yesterday in Parliament?
More than a few times, how fortunate I feel to represent East Renfrewshire, which is home to the majority of Scotland's Jewish population. We are a diverse, vibrant community, and we're so very much the better for it. Last week, I joined children from Calderwood Lodge Primary School for an excellent online lesson about the realities of the Holocaust, where we heard from Hedy Argent, whose very ordinary childhood in Vienna was turned upside down one day just because she and her family were Jewish. And she spoke so powerfully to the children about her own childhood and how, as things changed, she was ostracised and bullied at school by the teachers as well as the students before her family had to flee. And one thing which she still remembered vividly was the personal impact on her of one friend, just one, who stood with her against the tide of hate and demonstrating, as Hedy said, that the right thing is not always the easiest. Mr Deputy Speaker, last night I was fortunate to attend an excellent event organised by East Renfrewshire Council, where we heard from the family of the late Reverend and Eva Zoltan. It must have been very difficult for them, but they told very bravely a chilling story of their parents' experience during the Holocaust, made all the more so because clearly life had moved quite quickly from just day to day to terrible, unimaginable horror. And that's a thought we need to carry with us, and increasingly so, because Holocausts don't just happen overnight. They creep up gradually with intolerance and hatred and the othering of minority groups allowed to happen little by little because nobody's brave enough to do what that wee girl, Hedy's friends, did and say, no, that's not right. We don't treat people badly just because of their identity, just because they are different to us.
Yes, having the courage to speak up and saying this is not right. I'm sorry we missed a bit of a sound on the first clip that we had Antonio Guterres of the United Nations, and he was saying Oh, I see. Oh, we didn't hear it in the studio. But Mr. Guterres was stressing that we have to today still fight anti-Semitism and we still have to fight racism. So is that a thing that you, the three of you, find today that's something which is still going on?
It's definitely still going on. I think it's a really important thing for us to do to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, because, you know, of course, this is an issue every day, but making sure that we do pause and reflect and consider how the Holocaust happened and what the circumstances were then, and maybe look in on ourselves now. and say, well, how is the world now? So there's a dual purpose really to that particular day, of remembering all those who were killed, but also making sure that we do take account of the lessons that they're able to tell us for our lives today. And I think that it's undeniable, sad but undeniable, that there is a rising tide of intolerance. And I certainly am aware of that in my work, and I'm sure that your other guests will see that in their day to day too. And we need to be, I think, very careful to guard against that and to speak out against it wherever we have the opportunity to do so.
Yes, there was a theme in what Kirsten said, what yourself said yesterday in the House of Commons. Smajo, did you recognise the idea that it creeps up that gradually outing or othering one particular group means that you can move from a position of harmony and peaceful coexistence very suddenly to a position of enmity? Is that something that you recognise in your family's experience from when you were younger?
Yes, definitely. I've been speaking at various Holocaust Memorial Day events up and down the country, and I've been fortunate enough and privileged to hear Holocaust survivors speak. And I would urge everyone watching this and listening, if you do get a chance to hear a Holocaust survivor speak, to do so, because there's not many around. But I'm always, I think, terrified by the similarities that I hear and the experiences. And my experience in Bosnia is very much a child's experience. But as I get older, I do reflect on what happened in Bosnia differently, and I see it more from my parents' perspective. As a child, you're too busy playing and being a child. But I often think back to the sort of trauma and anxiety and pressure that my parents must have felt years leading up to the genocide in Bosnia, because it didn't start in 1991. That divisive rhetoric, the othering, the dehumanization of Bosnian Muslims started, in the early 80s. We had the Winter Olympics in 1984. Slobodan Milosevic came to power a couple of years after that. So all of these things were happening in the background. As I said, I was too young to notice them. But now with time, I reflect on all of that far more, and it's frightening to see the similarities between 1930s Europe and Bosnia in the 90s. And of course, the scenes that we're seeing in Bosnia at the moment, with, glorification of genocide and war criminals, it is frightening.
Now let me turn to Ika. Thank you, Smajo. So, Ika, also the Secretary General of the United Nations was talking about the echo chamber. He was saying, do you think there's a feeling nowadays that because of social media, that kind of intolerance can spread more easily? Is that one of the issues?
Oh, absolutely. If we just think about what happened in the World War II, and I'm listening to Mrs. Kirsten as well, so the anti-Semitic Nazi ideology must be considered in the broader context of age-old hostility towards Jews, and now today modern racism and nationalism. What we really can see, and that is definitely hatred, nationalism, alt-right nationalism, spreading all across media every day. We can see it. As journalists, we go to every part of the world, and we can see that that is actually really the case pretty much everywhere in the world. It just depending where you are at the moment. For example, if we take in consideration Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I have covered Bosnian genocide, I have covered the longest siege in modern history, and that is the siege of Sarajevo. And I myself, I was a refugee during war from 92 to 95. And just like Smajo said, my fellow Bosnian, I'm really happy to have you here on the show, to see you, Smajo, finally, and to meet you, is that what happened on July 11th, 1995, when Bosnian Serb units captured the town of Srebrenica in Bosnia and Herzegovina, considering it the worst atrocity in modern history, or worst atrocity on European soil after World War II, where in less than 2 weeks, Bosnian Serb forces systematically murdered more than 100,000 Bosniak, so Bosnian Muslims, is the worst act of mass killing on European soil, like I said, since World War II. And now we see just like Smajo said, glorification of war crimes and glorification of war criminals occurring at this moment in this country and in this region. And pretty much all across the world, we can see the geopolitical strategy of certain countries just taking parts in, for example, even now with the Russia-Ukraine almost conflict or Cold War or hybrid war, how people actually put themselves and how countries lead their policies and politics. Just recently, this month, on January 9th, the unconstitutional day of Republic of Srpska was celebrated in Banja Luka, where we could have seen the members of European Parliament taking part in celebration and denying genocide again and being in the company of genocide deniers. It is very concerning. Now, we have had in Bosnia and Herzegovina the former top international official, High Representative Valentin Inzko. He uses power to impose amendments to the country's criminal code to ban the denial of genocide and glorification of war crimes. Now, certain politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina have been doing their best to scrap that new law in order to continue deny genocide. So yes, Hugh, I would agree with the two other speakers here on the show, and I would agree with you that social media definitely has fueled some hate when it comes to certain minorities in the world, but also when it comes to certain communities or religious communities in the world. And that has the UN Secretary General very well said in his speech, where he said we have to step away, we have to move away from continuous racism and discrimination and the segregation in our countries. And I think Bosnia has been doing that and trying to do that with this new law. But of course, then what is known in the media and over social media, we've been having some troubles to try to really, really impose that law and have it enact.
Yes, one thing that Kirsten Oswald said yesterday is, although you're generally quite worried about the spread of anti-Semitism, for example, but you also made a point yesterday that the education is playing an important role. You stressed, didn't you, you praised the initiatives actually taken by the East Renfrewshire Council in primary schools and bringing, as Smajo said, those few Holocaust survivors who are still able to speak and appear in public. So that's something you drew attention to yesterday. So would you like to underline the role that education is playing?
I really would. I think it's absolutely crucial, and I think what Smajo said is absolutely correct, that if we can take every opportunity possible to bring Holocaust survivors into schools and to ensure that our young people, and frankly the not so young people could certainly do with listening to this too, but to make sure that the testimony of those who have experienced this absolutely unimaginable horror is heard and understood by the young people is a really important part of the education provision that we owe our young people to provide them with. And certainly where I live, East Renfrewshire Council has done an excellent job of that. I was virtually with one of the local primary schools, Calderwood Lodge, which is a Jewish primary school, the only Jewish primary school in Scotland. And we heard from a survivor, and it was very age appropriate. She spoke to the children about her own experience, and not only did that give the children a greater understanding of what had happened and how it had come to be that she and her family had had to flee, but it also allowed the children to start thinking around issues like, what do you do if you can see that someone is being treated wrongly? What are the situations that could arise? And, for them to reflect upon the fact that all of us can stand up and say, well, no, that's not fair. We must not treat someone differently or poorly because of their identity. And I think that's, it's a really valuable part of education, and, preserving the voices of those who have experienced Holocaust and genocide is really important in us learning whatever lessons we can going forward. But I have to say, one of the other things that I said yesterday in that debate is that, I am a little bit depressed about where we find ourselves. I think that we are in a situation where there is a an increasing hostility. There is not just online, but online particularly, a really nasty undercurrent, and that does seep out into the real world. So if you think about anti-Semitism, for instance, the increased number of anti-Semitic incidents which have been reported over the last year, it is a cause for concern. And of course you could read that across to Islamophobic incidents, and you could read that further to other different identities which people have. So education is absolutely vital if we're going to arrest that. I think that young people are usually extremely receptive to that. And, I've had the good fortune to be in schools when Henry and Ingrid Wuga, who a couple who came on the kinder transport, have spoken to children, and the young folk who listened to them were absolutely silent. They were absolutely focused on what they were being told. So yeah, I'm sure that all of the other councils in Scotland are equally engaged, but I think that the more engagement with that kind of programme, with programmes like the Lessons for Auschwitz visits, the better.
Right, turning to you, Smajo. So Kirsten was talking about East Renfrewshire. That's don't suppose you know that. That's just to the south of Glasgow, which where she lives, and the Jewish community there has been reflecting their history, really. Now, what about education in your life? Because your family, of course, brought you to Newcastle, and you've now made your life and your career there. What was education like for you? I think you were 9 when you came over. Is that right?
Yes, I had just turned 9 when we came over. So education for my parents was incredibly important. So before the war, I'll start with, actually, I was just about to start school. And then the Yugoslav National Army surrounded Stolac, so that didn't obviously happen. So I actually started school at the height of the siege of East Mostar in 1994. And really, school was our chance to just be normal, to get out of the house, to be with other kids, to be kids. And as I said, education was always important for us. My dad was taken to a Croatian concentration camp. And after he was released and brought to the UK, we actually started getting letters from him through the International Red Cross. So I was desperate to go to school because I had missed so much. I was desperate to get out of the house. And I was desperate to write to my dad. And we risked our lives daily to go. So we would go usually in the evenings when it would be darker, when it was safer. We would risk our lives, exposing ourselves to bombs, shells, snipers, but that was incredibly, incredibly important for us. So when we came here, the first thing that I realized when I landed at the airport in Newcastle, because we actually came as part of a UK government program called the Bosnia Project, which I've just recently been finding out more about. So we landed in Newcastle on the 19th of July, 1994. And the first thing that I noticed, I couldn't speak or read English. That was the first thing I realized. I had to start all over again. And starting school was incredibly frustrating. And I always like to tell one story, if I can, very, very quickly. But I started school in Newcastle. My teacher was absolutely incredible. Her name was Miss Webster. She had this thing at the end of each day. She would gather all of us around and she would sing this song. And I didn't know what they were singing. And actually, years later, I found out they were singing in Hebrew and English. It was an old Hebrew song. Everyone loved this. So I figured out that she would say someone's name, and that person's name would be used in the next part of the song, and they would get to go home first. Naturally, everyone loved this. I hated it. I was depressed. I had fantasies of running away, going back home. And we all sat down one day. I started learning English, so I was being taken out of class. I sat down one day. Everyone's excited. Everyone's looking at me. I'm even more frustrated and angry because they're all so happy. And they all started singing. And this time, all of a sudden, I could understand them. And it was weird for me. And it wasn't because I miraculously learned English in a day. But she went through this amazing effort to teach her entire class to sing this song in Bosnian. And for me, that was absolutely incredible. It was literally the first time in years that I felt like I belonged. I felt like I was at home. And I think the climate, the environment in the 90s, especially for refugees, is very different to the climate now. We had the most incredible people helping us and supporting us. So what I've been doing recently, actually, I've set up a educational trust called the Bosnian Genocide Educational Trust. We've teamed up with Show Racism, the Red Card, and using my experience, a child's experience of war, everything that I experienced in Bosnia, the journey to the UK, and we've set up a 5-week schools program, and we've just finished the pilot now in a school here in Newcastle, and it's been incredible to see the impact that it has on the students. Going through some of the feedback, seeing, students were saying, I thought the word refugee was a dirty word. And after this, their perception of refugees was incredible. So it was over 5 weeks. I went in the 5th week to see them. And that's made the biggest difference to that school. And as I said, the response has been incredible. So for me, all the work that I do is based on humanizing history, personalizing history. So just in January, I've done more than 30 talks up and down the country, schools, colleges, universities, Ministry of Defense, working with Holocaust Memorial Day Trust. But for me, that is the best way of actually making sure when we say never again actually happens, because for me, never again is missing a term. It's like never again, but what after that? And for me, it's taking action. So that's why Holocaust survivors, and listening to their testimony, people that are well in their 90s, so much energy and character and strength to share their story, that we must listen to them. Because I always say peace isn't the absence of war, peace is the actions taken to prevent war. And for me, education is key, and how we work with genocide education is something that I'm focusing on and trying to change at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad you shared that with us, Mal. So what a teacher, and I'm just thinking in those days too, she wouldn't have been able to look up Google Translate. That must have been some effort to put us into Bosnian. Now let me turn to Ika on this question of education. I don't know anything about how the Republic is held together, the two sides of your country. Now, how is the history taught in both sides, if you like, in the Republic of Serbia side and the Bosnia side? How do they handle the question of intolerance?
Actually, there are 3 sides. The history is taught on 3 sides in 3 different manners. But if I may, if you allow me, if the guests
Yes.
also allow me to tell my refugee story, because what Smajo just said is something that I think changes you as a person and adds value to your life and adds value to what you are set to become in life. And I think the story of Smajo's childhood is actually very incredible, even though it's connected to war, even though it's connected to the worst atrocities in this country. But I would like to just quickly tell my story, and I think Smajo will definitely understand it when I say it. So my story was completely the opposite from Smajo's story. I was born in Travnik, that is the central Bosnian town, and we were expelled from our homes in 1992. So we ended up being in Croatia, very close to the border of Hungary. And, listening to Smajo's story and the teacher that really, took, all the efforts in order to make Smajo feel included and to make sure that the word refugee is not considered a dirty word. For me, it was completely different. I was in a country that was at that time the aggressor on my country, especially in the southern town of Mostar, where Smajo is from. And I just recall every second of being refugee in Croatia at the time. And don't get me wrong, I have a lot of Croatian friends. I go to Croatia. I have my vacations there. It's a beautiful country. There are really beautiful people. But at that time, it was really challenging to stay in Croatia and being a refugee, especially being from that part of the country, where also the Croatian military was very active at the time. And I remember my teacher. I remember her name very well, Maria. She never really liked me, and during the 4-year war in Bosnia, she made sure that the word refugee is really considered a dirty word, and it led up to being basically beaten up on a daily basis in front of the school, my sister too. And those were probably the worst 4 years of my childhood. But after the war, after being refugees in Croatia, after going through all of that, after losing some members of my family, and after never seeing some members of my family either, it did not make me a worse person, or somebody who wants a revenge, or somebody who wants to give back at the same level. So what I was set to be and I was set to do is always to tell the truth, always to take part in education and educating other people. So when I became journalist somewhat 10, 11 years ago, I made sure this is why I became journalist, to tell those stories and to go around my country. I just returned to my country 10 years ago, and I needed to tell those stories. I wanted to tell my story as well. And because that education of, the word refugee is not a dirty word, especially when Bosnia and Herzegovina is dealing with so many challenges, including the migrant influx from Middle East. We have to all together really learn and really have the strength to say, hey, we need to be humane and we need to be human beings here. So I loved Smajo's story. Mine is a bit different, but again, I think we are both set on the same path, and it didn't corrupt us. It didn't corrupt me in any case. And when it comes to education, Hugh, to go back to your question, unfortunately, the history is taught in Bosnia in 3 different ways. And it's pretty much politically oriented. And in Republic of Srpska, you will have different history books. It will tell different history to the children. In Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, you will have different books, you will have different facts. And when you put that all together, you will see that the offspring, what we call them, even children who are born after the war, who have no idea what war was like, you can see them being radicalized just because of those books, because of that education that went completely south. And unfortunately, at this time, at this moment, nobody's doing anything to change that. There are alt-right political structures that will push that narrative and keep pushing that narrative. I would love to see where never again is really never again, but unfortunately that is maybe wishful thinking. And as we know, wishful thinking is is very dangerous thing to do, because you are set to think that something can be done, and then you get really disappointed because it's not being done. And in the region, and especially when it comes to even Holocaust denial, genocide denial, it's a very concerning point. When you see the highest representatives of the countries in the region denying genocide, denying war crimes, glorifying war criminals, you cannot but not think that never again is actually really never again. And especially in the past couple of months, where the situation, especially political situation and political tensions in Bosnia and Herzegovina are tightening, are really on a high level, you can even taste those tensions and the situation in the air, where you start feeling a little bit afraid and you start feeling fear that never again might happen again. Now, maybe not in the extent such as in 1995, but people in 92 to 95 didn't think it was possible either, but it did happen.
Yes, I mean, it's often been said by historians that if you were in Germany in the 1930s, you would have found the most civilized, the most cultured, the most modern states, and it would have been possible to believe that it would have slid into Nazism, 10 years later. But yeah, so language, yes, we must avoid demonizing, we must avoid othering and using language to separate. We should use language, as you do, Ika, to inform and educate and tell the truth.
Absolutely.
We're going to move now talking about the situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina. One of the members of the Scottish Parliament, Marie Todd, visited Srebrenica. I think this was 2 or 3 years ago, and I think you met her there. So we're now going to turn to a clip of the interview you did with Marie Todd of the Scottish Parliament. So let's have a look at that clip now.
Charity Remembering Srebrenica Scotland was established as a charity in 2015.
Yes.
And organizes commemoration events to mark the acts of genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 90s. So there are commemorations in Scotland.
Yes.
Every year, regularly. All right. Are you aware of the 10th phase of genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina? And that is denial of what happened in the countries of the Western Balkans. Are you aware of that?
I have heard people talk about that since I've arrived. I mean, what I can say is that the international community is very, very clear that genocide happened here.
Even though if it failed Srebrenica back then?
Absolutely.
It's very clear.
It's very clear. The international
genocide.
Community is absolutely clear.
The National Court for former Yugoslavia, the International Justice Court said massacre in Srebrenica is genocide. This was an interview for German Deutsche Welle. This is Serbian Prime Minister Ana Brnabić, where she openly denies genocide in Srebrenica. This interview took place in November last year, so November 2018. What do you say to something like this?
The international community is very clear that what happened here in Srebrenica and in several sites actually in Bosnia-Herzegovina was genocide.
And how would you react to a statement like this when you hear something like that? And this is on almost on a daily basis. So from multiple politicians, not only from Serbia but also from Bosnia-Herzegovina.
So it makes it very, very difficult to move on from the conflict, from the war, if there isn't an acknowledgement of what happened and an attempt to understand and an attempt to bring justice to the situation. All of those things make it very difficult to move on. And in most situations around the world where this has happened, that acknowledgement has been necessary to bring about reconciliation. So it's vitally important that there is further attempts to reach an acknowledgement and a shared understanding of what happened, and then progress can be made. The international community is absolutely clear, though, that what happened here is genocide.
Right, so Ika, I don't know if you've go ahead. Go ahead, Ika,
Marie
please.
Todd, yes, Hugh. Marie Todd, she visited, and now we can see in our conversation that was 2019, that was summer 2019, so just 6 months before the pandemic struck, before we heard about the virus. And she was here in Srebrenica, and then she came to Sarajevo. We picked her up, and David Hamilton, who is the chair of the charity Remembering Srebrenica Scotland, he put me in touch with her. And this is the first time I heard that Scotland is doing so much when it comes to commemorating the victims of genocide in Srebrenica. But Marie Todd did something extraordinary then. She, as a minister for youth and education at the time, she made sure that Srebrenica genocide is being taught in schools in Scotland. And this is exactly what we are talking about here tonight, and that is the education, telling the truth, keeping the truth alive, and making sure that the verdicts of the ICTY and the International Courts of Justice are being upheld and that they are being respected. And this is exactly what she has done. And I ever since I met Marie Todd, I was really drawn to Scotland, and as you know, the history is very known. I was there in Scotland, and I got to meet David Hamilton, and of course, meeting Marie Todd. I realized that Scotland is actually really, really doing a lot on making sure that the education is there, that the truth is being told, and that the victims and the families of the victims are never forgotten.
Yeah, Kirsten, can I ask you about the educational experiences you've been taking part in? You were, of course, talking about Holocaust survivors. Have the children there also been introduced to the idea that other genocides have taken place, such as in Rwanda and, of course, in Srebrenica and other parts of the world? Has it been widened out?
Yes, it has. There are some really excellent initiatives. I particularly would point to the Holocaust Educational Trust, who make sure that there is information there for young people and for schools which covers the Holocaust but subsequent genocides as well, and allows those who have lived through these terrible experiences again to speak directly to young people and makes their testimony as available as possible. And I think that one of the reasons that matters so much is because, of course, we need to make sure that young people are aware of what has happened in the world, but the ability to hear directly from someone who has experienced something so terrible in their lives so recently, I think really matters, because it would be very easy to think that these things that they're being taught in schools are history. And of course, yes, they are history, but this is something that has happened very recently. It's still happening in some areas of the world. And if we're not very mindful, then it can happen again and happen more and more. So that notion that we're talking about individual people, we're not talking about dry history books, we're not talking about numbers, we're talking about people, families who've been loved and whose lives have been snuffed out in the most terrible ways. Young people do need to understand that. They need to understand what happened here in Europe, as we've just heard so eloquently. And, you know, if you look at the world just now, think about the Uyghur Muslim population in China, that's happening again. And, you know, I am absolutely confident that our young people will be mindful and aware of that. But we need to make sure that we talk about all of the realities of the here and now too, because we have a responsibility to those people, those families there, just as we do to reflect on the history of what has gone before.
Yeah, now let's turn to David Hamilton. Both Kirsten and Ika have referred to David, who represents the link between Scotland and Bosnia. He's also now a prominent member of the Scottish Police Federation, though he wasn't doing that at the time. But let's now have a clip from David Hamilton.
But the pictures you've shown me in Glasgow, we had an opportunity to talk to each other there as well. In your city, about my country, it leaves an impact on one. I have to be honest about that. But the smile on your face in the pictures and your humanity is just incredible.
We got a lot of. We were shelled. We were shot at by the anti-aircraft guns. It was difficult, and you know what I did write letters to my family. You know, saying, if you're getting this, and I'm afraid the worst has happened. And that was quite emotional for me, you know, doing that, because I'm thinking I think that's when you kind of face your own humanity. The Srebrenica story, in much the same way as the Holocaust Memorial Trust deal with telling these lessons and sharing that. And, you know, it mustn't be forgotten. When we meet the mothers of Srebrenica and the survivors of the genocide, it really means so much to us to be able to tell them that we hear you and we're doing something about it. And that gives them, you know, if they're brave enough to tell us their stories and the pain that for them every time they do that story, then it's the least we can do is take that back to Scotland and pass that on.
If that's the only thing you did, take away the 90s in Bosnia, if that's the only way you did, gave the voice to the voiceless, you've done for a lifetime. Thank you for that. Thank you for doing that.
So that was yourself, Ika, talking to David Hamilton a couple of years ago. And yeah, go ahead.
That is actually not a few years ago. That is just a month and a half or 2 months ago. I met David during COP26 in Glasgow, and I had no idea that he had a Bosnian album. And this is a story of David Hamilton. He was a humanitarian who was in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the 90s. This incredible Scot that risked his own life to be there and to help those in need. And the pictures that he had on his phone, and me as a journalist, I wanted those pictures because those pictures were something that nobody has ever seen. And this is what drew me even closer to Scotland, seeing that how many Scots, and it's incredible. Wherever I went, there's another Scot that was in Bosnia and Herzegovina as a humanitarian or a part of NATO at the time. So this is the story of David Hamilton, and we had that chat to talk about not just Police Federation of Scotland, but also to talk about his Bosnian stories, and it was him that put me in contact with Marie Todd, and me just not thinking about it, I realized it quite later, just 2 years later. So that's the story of David Hamilton, another amazing Scot that really cares about the truth, that is now chair of Remembering Srebrenica Scotland, just like I said before, and that's making sure that the truth is being told, that the education is there, and that we never forget the victims and the families of the victims, but also to keep spreading the truth and keep saying the truth, because there are too many genocide deniers at this moment. So we need friends who will be saying and telling the truth all around the world, and David Hamilton and Marie Todd are two of those.
The first time I came across the words ethnic cleansing, that phrase ethnic cleansing, was, I think, during the Srebrenica events. And in this country, Ika, I think the best coverage was done by Channel 4 News. And it's interesting you talk again about denial. There was a small political group in Britain actually accused the Channel 4 News of fabricating, if you believe, of fabricating their stories on Srebrenica, but they were taken to court and that small group their case was thrown out. So that's, if you like, a precedent that says that you can't get away with Holocaust denial in Britain. But I think the Channel 4 News was very good then. But that's the ethnic cleansing phrase, I think, kind of really is another way of saying genocide, isn't it? So let's just go over what we mean by that. By United Nations law, I think this means an attempt to exterminate or at least remove an ethnic group, either completely or remove them from a territory. So ethnic cleansing, definitely, it's the same thing, really, isn't it? Ika, is ethnic cleansing the same as Holocaust?
You're looking at the.
I'm sorry.
We have to make sure that we know the very definition of genocide and ethnic cleansing. Now, there are a lot of polemics when it comes to genocide and ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Herzegovina. You will hear the very Prime Minister of Serbia and the member of Bosnian presidency, Dodik, and the Prime Minister of Serbia, Ana Brnabić, which we mentioned in our conversation with Marie Todd, the very deniers of genocide, where they say, but look, it cannot be genocide if we didn't kill the entire population of the town or that entire community. That is not correct. So the definition of genocide is very simple, and it has been ruled by the International Courts of Justice and ICTY, where it said that the genocide is not only, you don't even have to kill one single person, but even the intent to do that, to ethnically cleanse a community or a territory, that is even genocide. So you don't even have to kill one single person, but if you have the intent to do that, that is even classified as genocide. And we must make no mistake there that what happened in Srebrenica is not only the intent, but it has been put to action. So genocide, this is what the ruling is of the ICTY, and just like Marie Todd said, that those are the rulings, and we are not making any mistakes about it.
Can I come in there?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think that's really important for we've just heard, because we have to be quite uncompromising about that. We can't countenance people who are denying Holocaust or who are denying genocide. That's simply unacceptable. We are, I think, in the international community very clear about these things, that there are clear guidelines which allow us to identify exactly what's happened. And if there are people who are trying to suggest otherwise, and you've spoken about how some of them found themselves in court in the UK because of that, I think that we have to be really clear and be really focused in calling that out wherever it is, because they don't, they assume that some people won't do that. They assume that they will be allowed to put these lies out there. And, part of the responsibility that we all have, I think, is to make sure that they're not able to do that, and that we do clarify the situation and call it exactly what it is.
Now, turning to Smajo, are you aware of these links between Scotland and Bosnia? And are you yourself involved in the group you've set up? Are you involved with any of these activists working in Scotland?
Well, yes, I do quite a lot of work actually with remembering Srebrenica. I haven't done a lot of work in Scotland actually, but I do know and recognise this connection between Scotland and Bosnia. I've got actually a friend, Jimmy James is his name, who was a British soldier. He quit the British Army. He was 22 years of age, and he went to join the Bosnian Army in Mostar. This was obviously in the 90s. He had a meeting in a town called Čapljina near Mostar with General Praljak, and Praljak was a Croatian general. If you remember, he drank the poison when his sentence was read at The Hague. And in this meeting, General Praljak told Jimmy, we've struck a deal with the Serbs and we're going to divide Bosnia into two. And this was with a group of predominantly, I think, British soldiers at the time. And Jimmy said, well, what about the Muslims? And he said, who cares about 2 million Muslims? We'll just kill them. So Jimmy left. He said he didn't want to be a part of this. And then he went to join the Bosnian army after that. And actually, it was his footage. He recorded the destruction of the old bridge. And it took him, I think, 5 days to get that footage, going through mountains, up mountains and so on to Sarajevo, and it was his original footage. As far as I know, there's 2 films of that destruction. One was filmed by a Bosnian man and the other one was filmed by Jimmy James. So yes, this connection for me, and Jimmy James is such a great friend now, and I speak to him regularly and see him. He lives in London. It's incredible. But just one thing I would like to add, yes, there was 2 international courts. So it was the ICTY and the ICJ that actually recognized the genocide in Bosnia, but there was also actually a German court that ruled that genocide happened as early as 1992. I think it was in eastern and northern Bosnia, so not just Srebrenica. That was appealed by the defendants, and that appeal was squashed, and then the actual genocide verdict was upheld by a 3rd international court, and that was the European Court of Human Rights. I've just quickly checked that because I never know which one it is. So there's actually 3 international major rulings on the genocide in Bosnia saying that actually genocide started as early as 1992, and Srebrenica was just the culmination of atrocities that happened across Bosnia. Because sometimes I've been in talks, as I said, up and down the country. I do this regularly. I've done it for 7 years. And well-meaning people say, 8,000 people died in Bosnia, when in reality more than 100,000 people died in Bosnia. 50,000+ women and girls were raped. There are 20,000 registered rape victims in Bosnia today. Those are female registered rape victims today. There are more than 2,000 registered male rape victims, again, which is something that we just don't know about at the moment. So there are still so many unknowns about Bosnia, and then genocide denial has done so much. And because it's been left unchecked for 20 years now, 25 years, it's not like what's happening in Bosnia now with the genocide denial and glorification. It's something new. It isn't. It's happened for so many years. But yes, going back to Scotland, yeah, I know how much incredible work goes on in Scotland. And as I said, Jimmy James is definitely one of my heroes.
Yeah, thank you. That's an inspiring story. Now, as we move towards the end of our discussion tonight, I wonder if we could, if we could look forward and look at positive messages for the future. What would you like to say now, Ika?
May I just add something more to Smajo? I think it's very important to say, especially when and of course there are positive messages. We're not going to end this show on a negative note, because there is no need for that. As long as there are people like Kirsten, like Linda Graham, like Smajo, Beso, like you, Hugh, there is no need to end anything on a negative note. But I have to say that when it comes to ethnic cleansing, the new data showing that there are probably more Bosnians outside of Bosnia than inside of Bosnia, than in the country, which means that According to the last population count, there are only 2.5 million Bosnians now in the country. But according to the last and even older population count outside of Bosnia, diaspora, there were already 2.2 million. So we are estimating that there are probably more Bosnians outside of the country than in the country. So you see the exodus happening even today, and this is exactly because of the situation created in Bosnia and the negative situation created in Bosnia, and the tensions that people, very young people, the entire families, the entire communities are leaving this country. 170,000 people will leave Bosnia, actually left Bosnia by the end of December 2021. We're in January 2022. So the new data is just about to come. So when you talk about ethnic cleansing, it has never really stopped. It doesn't only have to be during the war. Ethnic cleansing can be also the political frightening of the population that makes them leave the country. And I'm still here with my family, but I'm not sure if that's going to be the case in a couple of years if this situation is continuing. But there are positive messages. I would of course allow maybe Kirsten and Smajo to start first with positive messages before. So putting this information and a positive message in one, I don't think it really mixes well. So I hope Smajo and Kirsten has something more to say.
Yes, well, I'd like to come to Smajo just now. Do you see? I don't know how much you pay attention to Bosnian politics. Are you up to date with what's happening on the ground? Have you any good news to report from there?
Obviously, my experience of Bosnia is different because I've been in the UK since 1994, and I never like to speak on behalf of Bosnian. I speak on behalf of my family. I share my experience of what happened in Bosnia in 1994, 1995, that period where I was there throughout the war. I'm not a political analyst. I'm a historian. I'm an architectural historian. I'm a lecturer at Newcastle University. So my experience is different, but I do know that my family in Bosnia are worried. I've got friends and family already trying to leave because they're trying to obviously do what's best for their family. I think Ika mentioned at the start that in the 90s, no one thought anything like that could happen in Bosnia, and unfortunately it did. So I do speak to them regularly through the work that I do here. I have meetings regularly with politicians and analysts in London and so on. But for me personally, I think to summarize just very quickly, going back to Bosnia, it is like going back to a crime scene. I go back and I see places where my family members were killed. I see the same perpetrators. Yes, we've had Karadzic and Mladic and so on, some of the high-ranking officials convicted, but vast majority of the foot soldiers are in Bosnia. And we see the same neighbors that torch our homes. I see the same neighbors that took my dad. We see the same people, as I said, that killed members of my family. But what's incredible about Bosnia, and what Ika said earlier on, it didn't make us worse people. And I think that's incredible about Bosnia. And there's so much that we can learn there. When you hear people speak about what they experience in Bosnia, they don't share hatred. They don't share anger. I've just taken part in the Holocaust Memorial Day national ceremony, and I spoke in a school, and I spoke about a moment which was the 24th of January 1994, when my mom's sister, so my auntie Amina, was killed. And I speak about this moment because it's such a life-defining moment. In that moment, winter of 1994, we were hungry, starved, we had no food. Up to that point, we were eating chicken feed and grass to make pies. We burnt everything that we could in the house. We had snow. I didn't know where my dad was by that point. I didn't know where my uncles were. When my auntie died, the easiest and the most soothing thing for my mom to do in that moment would have been to tell us that all creations are the same, that all Christians are the same, to direct all of our anger at them. But she realized what impact this could have on us. And she explained this situation very clearly. And something that she said, the best way to resist those was not to become hateful like them. And my mom is religious, and she always used faith to rationalize these things. But my point is, it's not just my mom that did this. My grandparents did the same, and all mothers across Bosnia. When you hear the mothers of Srebrenica speak, as I said, you don't feel an ounce of hate. When people have experienced such awful things, they don't want what they experience to happen to anyone else. So I know in Bosnia there are still more good and honest people that want peace. People of all religions and ethnicities and races that want peace. So I'm hopeful, but as I said, I'm in the UK, so my experience of that is different. So maybe Ika can tell us more about that.
Yes, hope not hate. Ika, is there any sign of, I don't know, on the ground, is there a middle ground in Bosnia? It sounds to me like you have Dodik on one side and the Croatian side and the Bosnian side. So is there a middle ground? Is there a politics
Absolutely.
that can bring people together?
You don't need politics in Bosnia to bring people together. People come together on their own. We don't need politicians to bring us together, because everything that they have been doing for the past 25 years since the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed was divide us. So the good thing and the positive thing about Bosnia, and I will add to what Smajo just said, is that there is no hatred. We are not taught to be hateful towards each other. We are not. And Sarajevo, when you look at that, there's a cathedral, there's an Orthodox Christian church, there's a mosque, and there's a synagogue, all in 200 meters square. It tells a lot about the culture and the people of Bosnia and Sarajevo and Mostar and wherever you go in Bosnia, people will be there. Like in Scotland, you guys say we'll put a kettle on, and this is something that I really love about Scotland too. But this is in Bosnia as well. There is no hatred. We don't need politics to bring us together. We bring each other together on our own. We believe our own instincts. And the good thing about Bosnia as well is, and this is the positive message, is that we have so many friends in the world. And as time is passing by, I'm learning that we have so many friends in Scotland as well. Bosnia is 1,000 years old. It has survived many occupations, many occupants, and it will survive whatever comes on our way. And this is the story of Bosnia. We are a beautiful European independent country that cares about people, that is have their guests in their house, and just like the Scots, this is why we have so much in common, the Bosnian and Scotland. But the positive message has to come out of Bosnia, and that is, there is no hatred. We are here to really live. We want to rebuild this country. Even though as many people are leaving the country, there are also people coming back and staying in this country, fighting for this country's future, and having our children here. And of course, again, I have to say it, keeping the truth alive and keeping the peace alive. Such a fragile peace that we have in this country, keeping it intact.
Let me just finally turn to you, Kirsten, because you're the only politician among us here tonight. So we don't need politics. In some places, maybe
I think, but
better without them.
I think that's right, and I absolutely defer to the greater knowledge of the other two panelists, and it's humbling actually to be here and able to listen to what they have to say. But you asked about what gave us hope, and no, you're right, it isn't politicians. The thing that gives me hope in all of this actually are groups of young people that I'm aware of, that I've been involved with, who are working really hard on making sure that people do know what's happened and preventing it from happening again. So groups like Yet Again, which is a youth-led organisation aimed at genocide prevention, Never Again Right Now, which is a pan-European youth-led organisation with the same aim, and another group of young people that are working with the Uyghur community to try and make sure that their plight is recognised. So these are not politicians, they're not people with high profiles, they don't have the platform that high profile people have, but they haven't let that stop them trying to make a difference, and they actually are making a difference. And that's maybe the lesson that I would take away, that it's about individual people and their willingness to stand up and be counted, and that actually can have a real influence on what happens.
Thank you, Kirsten. We've had some inspiring stories tonight from all three of you, so thank you very much to Ika Ferrer Gotić in Sarajevo, to Smajo down in Newcastle and to Kirsten, Oswald just outside Glasgow down in East Renfrewshire. It's been great to have the three of you on the programme tonight as we consider Holocaust Memorial Day, which was yesterday. So that's it from Broadcasting Scotland tonight, and we're back on Sunday lunchtime with the full Scottish and back to the 7 o'clock news broadcast from Monday onwards. So thank you for watching. I'm Hugh Stewart, and good night.